Well, thank you all very much for coming tonight. As you're all probably aware, just being here, it's 8 days now until the first anniversary of the Egyptian revolution, and we're incredibly lucky to have a stellar panel to discuss the current political situation in Egypt. First of all, I'd like to introduce Tahrir Square, who's an Egyptian writer, author of Egypt on the Brink, From Nasser to Mubarak. Sitting next to him is Tahrir Square, a political and cultural commentator whose most recent book, which is published in a couple of days now officially, is entitled Cairo, My City, Our Revolution. To the left of me is Hassam Abdallah, who's a fertility consultant and a political activist, one of the leaders of the student movements in Egypt in the 1970s. He tells me he's also the father of activist and actor Khalid Abdallah, who some of you might remember from the film The Kite Runner. And finally, we have Abdel Latif Al-Manawi, who's former head of the Egyptian Radio and Television Union, overseeing all news content, and founded Radio Misa, pioneering radio broadcasts, who's also got a book out, which is Tahrir, The Last 18 Days of Mubarak. Now, I think we're going to start off to get you all in the mood with a short film by the Mozarine Collective that's going to last a couple of minutes. And actually, two of the people involved in this, these are Ataf's and Hassan's children. That's right, isn't it? So if you can show that.
Can I just say something about it before it starts? Because it's just important to note that it's a film which is made with the aim of mobilization. It's just been put out about 4 or 5 days ago. And it's called Shab Lissa Yurid Isqat al-Nizam. People still want to remove the regime. And it's 4 minutes, and it's produced by the Mozarine Collective, of which my son and Hussein's son are both members. It has no words, and it is a film for mobilization. So get ready for the 25th of January. Should we have the lights out?
Buy your tickets.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Please.
last year. I mean, Tarek, I mean, maybe I can start with you. I mean, there have been elections. The first round of elections are complete now. But I mean, the political situation in Egypt still remains incredibly complex and fraught. I mean, maybe you can talk a bit about where you feel that the situation is right now.
Okay. I guess the start that I usually try to put in front of any audience, and sometimes pay out, hold on, that's really boring, but at least that's how I see it, is that the story of Egypt really is effectively, in my mind at least, 4 stages so far. One really started in the mid-19th century, I would say. So it's not really 1 year. And that lasted roughly for 1 century, I would argue. And that, to a very large extent, in my mind, was a time when this society looked to you, really here, to Europe. And to a large extent, that was Arab liberalism. A society that tried more or less to import a lot of notions from Europe back to the Arab world at its center, Egypt. That was a very top-down experiment, if you'd like, the elite of the society trying to affect amazing changes. But that experiment failed, and why it failed is a really long story. And then we had another experiment in Egypt, Arab nationalism, in my view, the 1950s, the 1960s, and that also failed, though it was the complete opposite, in my view, a bottom-up approach. If you'd like, supposedly the wants and needs of the people are to be materialized into strategies of the country and leadership coming from the people, the ordinary people. But that also, again, failed. And then we had the past 35 years, which, in my view, and I think what we are seeing across the world, the Arab world now, substantiates that, also failed. And amidst these multiple failures, something very interesting happened in Egypt specifically, but also across the Arab world, is that the population doubled. So basically, if you look in 1980, we were roughly in Egypt almost 45 million people. Today, we are 80, 85 million people. So you had roughly 35 or 40 million people born in this part of the world, in this country. 2/3 of them are under 20 years old. They inherited all of these failures, and they are not political failures. They're effectively social failures in jobs, education, in services provision, and loads of them actually here in Europe you see coming for immigration, waiting for days and hours, sometimes in humiliating conditions, trying to find visas. And in my view, this is the key to understanding the political situation in Egypt. You have effectively, in my view, a generation that is rejecting not just the last 5 years of President Mubarak's reign, not just the inheritance to Gamal Mubarak, not just the business elite that came to dominate that society, not just the military establishment dominance over the country, but the entire heritage of failure that this country has had for arguably a century, at least 60 years, the state's republic's life. And I think what's happening right now over the past year is that the remnants of the regime, not the regime of Mubarak, but the state, the pillars of the state that were not broken away over the past year. The deep state, think of it as the military establishment, think of it as some very well-entrenched financial and economic powers in the country, and others, some players in the state media, some very, very well-entrenched pillars of the old state that are still more or less trying to defend not just economic privileges for one segment or another, not just the military's prerogative on few things, but effectively trying to stop the birth of a new state. And in my view, it is this grand objective that this generation is just trying to reject the whole heritage of failure and form a complete new state. And if you look at from that phenomenon or from that perspective, I think you can see a more macro story that's more social, more socio-political at least, as opposed to just the micro picture of what happened last month versus Maspiro in October. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much, but that's my view at least of the situation right now.
I mean, Hassam, I mean, do you agree that there have been successive failures, and that actually this is a state-building process, no matter how fraught it is at the moment, that this is what the entire project is about? Because you get the feeling in visiting Egypt, where I was last week, that some people wouldn't necessarily agree that there was that wholesale reinvention required.
Well, there will always be people who would not think of that. But I really want to personally start from the 25th and go backward. In fact, even Tunisian revolution. You got the phenomena of not only what happened in Egypt, but the whole Arab revolutions, or what they call the Arab Spring. And you look at it, he's absolutely right in citing the young generation who's fed up with failures. Whether it's 150 years or 30 or 60 is debatable. But the real aspect of it, that you got a massive young generation, and they go across social classes. So it's not only the poor uprising, you got the middle class, the educated, the whole lot. And they are fed up in all these countries with military rule, in fact. Not only the current military rule. If you look at the Arab states and revolutions, you will not find them, by the way, in the Gulf or whatever, though it's more oppressive perhaps, but there are money and there are other things, and it's a tribal situation. But you get into all of these governments, and Iraq would have been, had it not been for the intervention of the Americans and others, that you will find that fed up of this state of lying, this military establishment that carries on. It had a political program initially in the 50s. They came and had some kind, the Arab nationalism program, development, speeding development, trying to create a state of social justice at a time when even there was socialist state and one-party rule and so on. This essentially led to the total Arab defeat in 1967, followed by an attempt to redress that, and in 73 there was a kind of, if you want, a truce or an equilibrium in forces. But thereafter, there was no purpose for the governments and these governments to stay, but to maintain their own privileges. By changing the power structure, you get a group of people who are ruling a country with no political program. You will get in fascism and communism parties that have a view about the future states. We've lived for 30 years or longer, actually, with a situation in which what you want is to maintain privilege and to carry on creating it. So you create a state of lies. We consume lies. In fact, the normal scenario that you don't believe anybody. It became synonymous to our words. When you talk, you say, inshallah, some people believe it's not going to happen. We have even a saying in Egypt, when I tell somebody else a story, I would say, I'm going to tell you something, but this is really true, as if everything else I say is not true. And this is actually is not since Kingdom Come. This is a new phenomenon, which is happening because we live in a state of oppression. And of course, the last 30 years, and especially the 10 years of the last 30 years, when all what was required is to try to pass the reign and to create a new Arab monarchies, as in Syria. Libyan guy tried to do it, Mubarak was trying to do it, and so on. And so you would have a revolution of people totally and utterly fed up, influenced by all sorts of ideologies coming and going, left, liberal, Islamic, of course. All of this is going in the mix. But the unifying force is the absolute and utter refusal of those youth of the continuum of this kind of state of oppression. Now, if we move forward and look at it today, some and a lot of commentators would say, well, the game is up. The military was able to maintain it. They got rid of the succession plan. And they are maintaining the old regime in every single aspect. And they are somehow in alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood, who, in my view...
I mean, do you believe that?
Well, not necessarily, but let me carry on my argument. And somehow there was an agreement between them and the Muslim Brotherhood. My personal view is not that there was an agreement or not. My personal view that the Americans... I never forget Tony Blair on the 27th of January last year, saying that, yes, of course, there should be a change, but it has to be managed. And he kept saying this time and time again. And managed that any succession should not be chaos and should not be anti-West. And the Americans have moved to maintain that whoever will come will not affect the treaty between the Arabs and Israel on one hand, and will not interfere with the flow of oil to the West. Therefore, it should not be anti-Saudi Arabian, and it should not be anti-Israel. They talked somehow to the Brotherhood, agreed that they will have a state, they will have a party, they will be recognized, and I don't blame the Brotherhood at all for talking to them, and you will not govern in total. And that is why the Brotherhood at the time said they will have 30% or whatever of parliament.
This is the same message that Jimmy Carter came away with last week, though, isn't it? He came away saying that there need to be guarantees for the military. And that's
yes, and that is what the Muslim Brotherhood talk about now. And then you got the third pillar, which some people anyway, and commentators are starting to write them out, which is the square, or the revolutionary forces, or the white coalition of youth, liberal, left, whatever. Of course, the Brotherhood on one hand have got the parliament, and they won the election fairly. Even if there was comments or whatever, they are the only organized force that went into that. But you would have the forces in the streets, and as far as I am concerned, for as long as there is a government with no national program, an oppression by an army, and there is no solution to the social questions and economic questions, then you will have a continuum of upheavals in Egypt and in the Middle East. And the people in this square will carry on in one form or the other. They're very inventive. If they're not in the square, they'll go out with the Kaziboon, the new attempt to show how much they lie. Lying is at the heart of this revolution. If you want to maintain military rule, as in Syria, now, as in Egypt before, you have to lie. Media have to lie. State media have to lie. People have to continue to, they kill people in Maspero and say they have no shots. They accuse Ala Abd Fattah of stealing a weapon and that he tried and killed one of the soldiers with weapons they claimed they have no bullets in them. So they said the army have no bullets whatsoever in Maspero. Yet, when they want to accuse any of our revolutionaries or whatever, then they will accuse them of using the same weapons that got nothing to kill with.
Sam, could I bring Nabil in here? Because, I mean, you actually, rather than being on the revolutionary side at the beginning, had a very, very significant role with the state media. I mean, what Hassan has called the state of lies. I mean, you've repositioned yourself, but I mean, where do you think that the situation is now? I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the continuing role of the Egyptian media in the last year.
Thank you for this chance first. I would like just to say that our main problem now, that as Egyptian, we are not dealing with each other as we own the country. All of us own the country. Nobody claimed that this country, it's his country, not others' one. I believe that the elite of the country, they just went and ununited. They went just to say that everyone claiming that he is the owner of the uprising, that he is the one who pushed. Everyone is trying to reposition himself. And this is one of the main problems. The situation now, simply just like that.
I mean, can I ask you? I mean,
yeah,
you've tried to reposition yourself somewhat, haven't you?
Yes. I'm repositioning myself. I'm even.
I mean, can I ask what the logic was behind that repositioning? Because you had a very, very prominent role for a long time.
Let me finish my idea, and I will just answer your question. So the situation now is just like that. The all Egyptian until 11th of February, they were united. They were just one person, I would say that. The feeling of changing, it was something spreaded last few months before last year. After 11th of February, after taking Mubarak out of the regime, every part of the parties tried, as I said, to claim that he is the one is having the main role. What happened after that? That the uprising has been hijacked by the Islamists. And the Islamists, they were not the part of the uprising from the beginning. But actually they have this kind of organization. They have in every village, every city, they have sort of representative, so they win the election easily. I believe that the main problem which we are going to face in the near future, that the economic problem, as I've heard today, that our reserve went down to 15 billion and instead of having 36 billion before. How can we do that? How can we face that? I believe that we can face that simply if we just have this side, this vision. If we have just one goal, I mean, all the elite, all the parties, all the political powers, with the army, they are not a non-Egyptian. I was in the TV building when the uprising, and I follow what's happening at that time. And I saw quite well that the army played a big role of pushing Mubarak to go away. And they played a role to protect people's movement. And if they took other steps, I would believe that it would be a bloodbath. We had it at that time. So I believe that Egyptian army are Egyptian at the end of the day. The army has, every one of Egyptian has a sort of relation with the army. Everyone served the national service with the army. I was a soldier one of these days. I believe every one of us, or at least was a soldier one of these days in the army. So everyone has sort of relation with this army. Yes, regarding the army, the SCAF now, and they have a sort of cooperation allying with Muslim Brotherhood. This is not planned, but this is unfortunately true. And we should ask ourselves, why? This is because they has been cornered, they has been pushed to have this kind of cooperation, this allying with Muslim Brotherhood.
By whom?
By all powers. By all powers, I mean. I mean by liberals, by lefts, by, I mean, we would play a sort of pushing for the SCAF to do what they have to do. We should, I mean, people now, they already knew where is the street. They knew. They knew now that they have the power to change. They knew now that they have the ability to make sort of changes and nothing will be over them. But again, we had a free election. But the question is, did we have a real democracy at the last year? This is my question. I mean, my concern now for the future is to try to get this country to the position it deserves. Regarding the reposition myself, as you said, I'm not stubborn. And I was playing my role as a professional in the public TV. And I played my role as far as I know, fairly, as much as I could at that time. And after, actually during even the events itself, I took a decision that my dream of having this public TV with a real meaning of public TV, with a real meaning of taxpayer TV. This is my goal. I'm a journalist from the beginning. I'm not a TV man. I started this work 5 years before I started.
Can I bring up that
Sure.
in here? Because I can see you tapping your glasses. I mean, do you accept this? Do you accept this analysis? I mean, it's. I mean, you know, not to throw it back at you. I mean, but do you? Is this a version?
Sorry.
Is this a version of the army's role in Egypt's life that you recognise? I mean, I know you wanted to read something,
no,
but
it
I mean,
doesn't
but do you feel that's something
I
you
think
recognise?
that basically, I think that everybody should stop even trying to make excuses for the military and certainly for SCAF. I think they have had an opportunity every minute of every day since the 10th of February, and they have abused it, and they have abused us. And I mean, anybody who was here the last time that I spoke in this room in March, or on the occasion when Hussein's son and my son also spoke for this club but somewhere else, would know that we were very much hoping that the military would honor their promise and would seize a historic opportunity to go down in history as a military who actually saved their country. And I toured during March here and in the States, and everywhere people were asking, but what about the military? How do you feel about having the tanks on the streets? And I would say that on the one hand, we really had no option because we failed to provide an alternative, a civil alternative that was strong enough to stand up to the military and take hold of power. It didn't happen. But that I believed that the military would honor their word, that they stepped forward and they said that they would never attack the Egyptian people, that every person who signed up for the military forces in Egypt had to swear an oath that they would never raise their weapon in the face of an Egyptian. And that in fact they had twice before, in the 70s and in the 80s, refused direct orders to attack protesters. And that therefore, and because they are part of society, because they are our brothers and our husbands and our sons and all the rest of it, we were going to trust them. Well, our trust was misplaced. Whether it is SCAF alone, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which wouldn't explain the brutality with which their orders are carried out, or whether this is an army that has become different somehow, that has been trained and and sort of mobilized and energized in some way that we don't understand. But this is an army that A, needs to return to barracks and have nothing to do with the government of the country, and B, that needs to let go of its commercial interests and be refashioned as a proper army, not as a business concern, and C, that needs to actually take its duties as a military seriously, because we are not a country without enemies. And at the moment, when we watch what happens on the street and in the square, I know who I would trust to defend me between the young people on the one hand and the army on the other, and it is not the army. So basically, no, the army is not being forced into anything. SCAF is making, it may be that there is division within the army. That's what we hear. That there are divisions, that there are people who are not happy with what's happening, that there are people who feel that the honor of the military has been besmirched. That may be true. But what we're seeing is we are seeing the results of actions, of orders taken by SCAF, and what is happening is that they are resorting to the same menu of oppression that has been used by the Mubarak regime. Everything. Brutality, disinformation, corruption, affecting and infiltrating the judiciary. There was actually an Al Jazeera film that listed 10 sort of strategies that were followed by both SCAF and by the Mubarak regime, and in fact it's even more brutal. We were just talking.
Can I ask you a quick question? Yes, I mean under the Mubarak regime, it's 2,000 and 3,000 people were dealt with by military tribunals.
Now 15,000.
Now between 12 and 15,000.
Exactly, and that was in 30 years. Not that one is hankering after the days of Mubarak by any means, but the fact is that the military have taken off the streets 15,000 young people, put them through the process of military tribunals. Now they've said they're not doing it anymore, but there are 4,000 young people serving military jail sentences at the moment, completely unjustly. And it was only really because Ali Abdel Fattah stood up and said, I will not be tried by the military, and served 56 years in jail, that they have now actually stopped.
Days.
Sorry, days in jail.
I was going to say, he's still young.
Sorry, 56 days in jail, that basically they have stopped this. And not only that, but this policy of shooting to kill, of shooting to maim, the number of young people who have had their eyes torn out by live ammunition for simply peaceably protesting is, beyond an accident. And in fact, and I'll say it very openly, that the tactics of the military now, with shooting to kill, with brutalizing, with humiliating, with shooting in the eyes, with building separation barriers and barbed wire, remind me of the tactics of the Israeli army, and I would not be surprised if they are training together.
Can I ask all of you? I mean, the elections are now finished for the lower house.
Excuse me, can you just I don't want to be positioned like I'm here to defend someone, or I just want not to be positioned like that. All what I'm saying is we should think about the day after.
But what is going to happen
the
the
day after? I mean, the day after. Before we take action, we should think, what are we going to do? What are we going to have? What's the future for this country? The worst day on my career, it was the day on 28th of January when I had this big army officer entering my office and telling me that we took control of the building and everything will be in cooperation together. This is my worst, this is my blackest day of my career. I'm not with military to be there. I'm with the civil society. We should think now, what we've done now, what we've done with this. I have the feeling that like we are talking about the enemy's army. It's not the enemy's army. It's the nation's army.
No.
It's the nation's army.
At the moment,
and it should be like that. And we should deal with them. All right. This.
Nabil, can I stop you here? I wanted, from what you've all said, I wanted to bring you on to the question, which is, there is a political crisis coming, it seems to me, and that crisis is, the relationship between power. The relationship of power between the remnants of the military who still want to hang on to power, and and the people who've been the new lower assembly that's been asked to write the constitution. I mean, do you feel, Hassan, that there's a crisis of legitimacy just around the corner in Egypt over these issues of who it is who actually has the final say on issues like presidential power, who writes the laws, what the guarantees are for the remnants of the military?
It all depends. I really want to comment on something Mr. Minawi said, but just it will all depend on how the parliament and the people in the streets will play. If there is a unison or even a degree of listening to the streets, and parliament takes its job as the only elected legitimate body in this country, it start to work on the constitution, etc. As far as I am concerned, the SCAF, and let's make that separation clear, okay? SCAF is not legitimate anymore to carry on with ruling Egypt. We have elected a parliament. This parliament has legitimacy, and it should work. And if it started to create an Islamic state, we will fight in the streets as we fought Mubarak for a democratic civil society. But there is an elected body of people that we should respect. The army as an army that fights on behalf of the nation, rather than kill the people in the streets. And I'm very grateful for Mr. Minawi actually to tell me an information I didn't know, that the army took control on the 28th. That means that the whole stories of Kentucky and other things in the square were orchestrated by the army, were orchestrated primarily by the army. It is the same lies that continue. They lie. They know that we know that they're lying. And we know, or some of us know, that they know that we know that they are lying. And they will continue that till we stop this circle.
Tariq, I was on the Corniche on the 28th when the first military vehicles came down, and people thought it was a good thing at first because they thought the police were retreating. They thought that they would be protected. So clearly there's a more complex relationship between the military and the Egyptian people. But where do you see this power struggle between these new sort of political institutions and the army playing out in the next few months?
I've just build on one point Mr. Minawi said, which I think shows, in my view, an utter failure to understand what has happened. He said before the 11th of February, Egypt was united. And then basically he jumped to the point of the 36 billion, I'm a banker by the way, the $66 billion that's now, oh my God, horror, $15 billion, as if this is the story of Egypt. I think one very important point, which will answer your question, is that over the past at least 5 years, if not more, look at what has been happening inside the universities, professional syndicates, the labor movement. We are talking about at least 3,000 demonstrations in Egypt, at least in 5 years. More than 10 of them were more than 150,000 people in the streets of Al-Mahalla, for example. What I'm trying to say basically is that the key story in Egypt, in my view, is demographic. Look at 45 million Egyptians today who are under 30 years old, who effectively cannot and will not be represented or accept that the remnants of an old regime that at its pillar today is a military establishment represented by people the age of their grandparents, who basically dictate the orders, even if we assume they have legitimacy. But then that takes us to the second point. Well, do they have legitimacy? And that's the initial point I try to put forward. The three stages that this whole power structure, since 1952 until today, put forward has effectively failed. So even if you take a historical point, they have failed. But now we have even something by far easier to understand. We did have elections, and that was your point. This election put forward today a parliament. That parliament actually is the representation of the people. And I would argue, that's a last point to what Dr. Hassam said, the parliament will not create an Islamic state in Egypt. Yes. And I would just leave it very simply because people sometimes misunderstand the complexity and the richness of this amazingly complex, unique country called Egypt. So it's not so simple to turn it between 18 days or 18 months into an Islamic state. So the final point is not one country. The story is that you have a new generation that, I'm so sorry, just rejects the entire power structure that has ruled this country, not for 5 years, not for 20 years, not for 30 years, at least for 60 years.
Adaf, I mean, where do you feel we are now? I mean, sometimes, I was in Cairo last week, I mean, sometimes it felt to me last week that there was a concerted pushback by the deep state. I mean, do you feel that even as these elections, which are ushering in, these new sort of democratic institutions, do you feel that there is a counter-revolutionary moment taking place in Egypt?
Yeah. But it's been happening since the 11th of February. The counter-revolution has been happening. It just sort of ebbs and flows. And at the moment, and of course, as time goes on, it becomes more and more critical that somebody has to win, and so you get more people killed on the streets or more eyes taken out, and so on. But also, I think that let's call them the revolutionary forces, are really settling in for the long haul. I mean, by revolutionary forces, I mean the streets that let's call it Tahrir, even though it's all the streets that are involved in the revolution, and all the labor movement, including strikes, including attempts to set up new syndicates, to take hold of the old syndicates and purify them, and so on. And of course also the work that is being done or that will start to be done now via parliament. So in my view, people going out to, well, in many people's views, not just mine, people going out to elections was also a revolutionary act, because if you could actually produce an elected body that could take power and that could represent you, then why not do it? And so you have several actually several strands happening all together, and they're settling in. You can see their strategies. That okay, it was brilliant that we had those 18 days. They were real. They were miraculous. It would have been amazing if we had walked out of those on the 11th of February into a clear space where we really were going to set in motion processes that would lead to everybody having bread, to human dignity, to social justice, and so on. That's not what has happened. I think that it is fair to say that had we sat back before the revolution and tried to work out what would happen, we would have thought that we would be fighting this fight now, but we would have been fighting it against Mubarak. It was because Mubarak crumbled, or because the army got rid of him, that we had that sense of tremendous power and achievement, which is good because it was real and because we can use it as a resource to keep going with. But it's not surprising with the interests that are being, that we want to get rid of, that we want to dismantle, that we are locked into this major struggle.
I mean, Nabil, where do you see it going right now?
I'm Abdul Latif, not Nabil.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's okay if you want to change it. No problem. Again, what we need now, I believe, what we want, I believe that we need to talk about the future. What are we going to do with this country? The situation now is just like that. We have over 60% of the parliament came by election, by free election, and it's from Islamists. And now we can see changes in the streets and in the attitude of the political powers in the streets. Now we start hearing about if the Copts are going to pay jizya or not, this kind of tax for others. We start listening or hearing about the statues which is considered as nude statues, and it has been covered because it's not allowed to have this kind of statues also. I mean, this country, which we want to be a secular country, I believe that it's in danger right now. This is the point. The other point is, we have this army who said and confirmed that they will deliver the power by end of June. Now we are in the second half of January. And we had the election, which we had doubts before that it will happen. But it happened already with these results. And now we are going to have this presidential election. I think the best thing now is to organize the real power, the 60% of the 30 years old. We should have a way to organize this power, to have a say in the future for this country. Because if we let everything going just like that, I believe that the country will be just run by the Islamists for the coming 30, 40 years. People choose them. Egypt is 85 million people. And Egypt is not just Cairo. And Cairo is not just Tahrir Square. Egypt is bigger than that. Egypt is more complicated than that. And I think Dr. Hussam wants
I wanted to stop you, and I do apologise for rechristening you, but I'm really, really sorry about that. But could I think this would be a good moment to throw open this debate.
Can I just have one point?
Yeah, one more, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, just very quickly, this is how we have been ruled in the last 30 years. Literally. We have a semi-civil society in which women can go out, men or some can drink, etc., and so on. If Mubarak goes, we will have this. Now, what you are saying is literally the same. We have the army. Either we accept a civil society with the army at the helm, forcing it, despite who has been elected, by recreating a force of the youth, which ultimately non-elected. We have to work, and we will fight for a civil state. You are right in one question. Do we have full democracy? We don't. Because we need to develop civil society, we need to develop trade unions, we need to develop all of those to fight the battles for democracy. But not on the expense of election and not by the power of the army to force a kind of a corrupt but not religious state. We are fed up with this.
Okay, can we throw this now open to questions from the floor? Because I know there are a lot of people who want to ask questions. So,
sorry,
sir.
Hello, my name is Dr. Wafiq Mustafa. I actually been with a group of MPs to Cairo. I've been twice over the last 6 months, and we met various people from the army to the peasants and people living in the graveyards in Cairo. The big problem in Cairo is there is a huge security vacuum, one thing. We should not kid ourselves that Egypt is too strong to break up as a country. There is many countries broke up.
So can we frame these as questions rather than statements? Is that all right?
My question is, Egypt has not gone through democratic change or reform. It's only gone through a form of free elections.
Sorry?
Sorry, can you repeat your question? Is it democratic change or?
There has not been a democratic reform of institutions in Egypt. They only been free elections which favored Muslim Brotherhood and favored the system which was created by Nasser, which is extremely corrupt system in my view.
Tarek.
I mean, your question implies that there are institutions in the country. Now, the argument I was trying to put, and actually I put in the book, was my book, that basically every single institution in the country, from the educational establishment, from the vast majority of the civil society, from some of the religious establishments on both sides, as well as many others, have been significantly weakened over the past 60 years. One argument I put in the book is that the notion of Egyptianism itself has been diluted repeatedly, consecutively, and slowly, and in its place, the idea of Islamism and Christianism has been building up slowly. So without going to too much philosophy, the notion that, oh, this country right after 11 February, by lovely some wand magic, would have a great Swiss-style democracy is of course illusionary.
I mean, would you like to comment?
No, I was just actually really going to say the same. I mean, what do people want? You know, isn't it enough to have actually gotten rid of the head of a tenacious and bloody regime? But also, we're supposed to have created democracy all of a sudden. I mean, you know.
But the Hadaf, it is not enough.
Take a long time.
It's not enough to get rid of him.
We need to do
more.
more.
We're not apologizing here. We are actually building democracy. You are fighting. Your kids are fighting, whatever, for a full democracy in Egypt. We are not saying enough getting rid of the regime, but we are not, you know, apologetic for not achieving democracy. It's a process that will take so many years to come.
And I'd like to say something else, which is that the thoughtful among the young people in Egypt, and they are many, are actually questioning whether democracy per se is enough. Because it's quite clear now that democracy on its own does not, i.e. going through an electoral process and so on, is not enough to deliver the society that people want, is not enough for government to be completely transparent and take only decisions that the people want. We see that here in this country, we see that in the United States. Therefore, our young people are actually in the job of trying to work out what more can happen. What are the models of society that are useful in the coming times, where we've seen, you know, the conjunction of global capital and sort of, you know, formal democracy not producing societies that people are happy with.
Oh, there's a question over here.
Can I talk?
Sorry, I'm going to keep this reasonably short because I know I've seen a lot of hands go up.
My question is very, very short to Mr. Menawi, and it's taking an issue with his opening statement about the Egyptian army. He said the Egyptian army is Egyptian. My question to him, isn't Hosni Mubarak Egyptian too?
Shall I answer?
Yeah, answer, please.
Yeah, everyone is Egyptian. Every Egyptian has the right to be Egyptian and to be judged as an Egyptian. And if he has something wrong, he can go to the court like Egyptian. And this is why I'm saying all the time that before having a democratic country or a state, I believe that we need to have a law state, because we cannot have a democratic country without having a law state. This is exactly what I'm asking.
State of law.
You believe that there should be reform of the legal processes?
Yes, of course, yes. And again, regarding the army, I'm not defending. All that I'm saying is, army is a solid institute in the country now, and it has committed itself that it will deliver the power by June. If they don't deliver the power by June, I'll be the first one to be in the same place like Ahdaf, whoever, that to ask them to go. But again, what I'm saying is that we cannot play this game of dividing the country. This is non-Egyptian, or this is Egyptian but bad, and it has to be go. It has to go. I mean, this is the army of Egypt, and it should be the army of Egypt. And they committed themselves, and we should follow them if they will deliver or not.
There's a gentleman there in the grey V-neck who's got the microphone, yes.
Yes, my question is to Mr. Menawi as well, or between brackets, Nabil.
I'm sorry.
You were...
I've seen your moment.
No, it's fine, it's fine. You were the head of the Egyptian radio and news, you were the head of the news of the Egyptian radio and TV between the 25th of Jan and the 11th of Feb. and you said this comment about the 28th, but you were the head of the news between the 25th and the 28th specifically.
That's right, yes.
And actually, the main message of the news at that time was that you were trying to deliver as a team that those in Tahrir Square were a bunch of thugs, that they deserve to be killed and deserve to be burnt. Don't you think that you were covering those officers who were killing us in Tahrir Square, and you actually, as a person, a killer, and you're giving us a speech about the Egyptian revolution?
Mr. Manawi.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your comment, but I don't think that I'm a killer. Actually, I'm not. I don't think that you have the right to call me that a killer. I'm a killer. But anyway, I will take this chance just to make an advertising to my book, which telling the story of what happened starting from 24th until the end of 11th February. Again, as I said, I'm a professional working with a dream to have a public media, a public TV. And it was very easy to me just to leave my place and run away. And what I'm going to do in the future is, because we never called people in Tahrir Square that they are thugs. It never happened. And I have the full recording of this 18 days of the broadcast. And my project, my coming project, is to get this 18 days as is on CD, to put it for everyone to judge. We made mistakes? Yes, we made mistakes. We were under pressure? Yes, we were under pressure. We tried our best? Yes, we tried our best. There is two stages in our coverage, starting from 55th to the 2nd, and from 2nd to the end of the days. Again, we did our best for the sake of the country. We didn't play our role, and this is what I said, what I told to all my colleagues at the time, and they are alive, all of them, so they can just confirm what we have done, that we are doing our job for the sake of the country, for the nation. From the first day, we were trying hard, maneuver the pressure we had at that time. And again, I'll take the chance just to say a lot of details will be in the book is coming, and
if you can open it up a bit from Mr. Al Manawi's role in state
thank
television, and look, I mean, who has the microphone now? I mean, is the question on a more general issue of what's happening now?
Unfortunately, it's still with Mr. Manawi, but away from crimination and recrimination. Actually, it is only because he didn't answer the question. He didn't answer your question about repositioning himself. This is really a turning point which could help us in reading the future of Egypt, because he was in the center of this. So I didn't get it yet how he's going to reposition himself, and it's a comeback, and how much trust he put in the army, because he was so close to them.
I mean, I really would like to move on to a more general question than simply looking at Mr. Al Manawi's role. So there's someone who would like to ask a question of one of the other panelists.
It's more of a general question, but you were talking earlier about how young people are looking at different models of society to try to find that democracy, and I wondered if you might be able to talk a little bit more about that.
Would you like to answer that one?
How it can move forward, really.
How can it move forward with young people?
Well, it was Hadaf actually.
It was
who
me.
mentioned
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Right. Well, really,
No
that's
problem.
all. I mean, one of them should be here, actually. I mean, I'm reporting what I hear from them. I know that they are looking at Brazil. They're looking at what happened in South Africa. They're just they're exploring structures like cooperatives, like different types of unionizing and different types of syndication. Like, they're very interested in decentralizing power as much as possible. But I don't have anything more concrete than that. This is all a ferment of ideas. Tariq, please.
I just want to add on one point. I think, as Hadaf rightly said, the leaders, if you'd like, I'm not talking about individuals, but the groups that triggered the whole thing. And actually, we do have some representatives here, I can see. But basically, the groups that trigger these things might be looking at different models. But I think the real story in Egypt, again, I'll probably repeat myself, it's not really what the 6th of April would do, or Al Abdel Fattah, despite the amazing momentum he has done, and those. I think it is, to a large extent, we are entering a new stage in Egypt's history. Again, Arab liberalism failed, Arab nationalism failed, the whole Nasserite era failed, Mubarak and the military failed. You have, at the end of the day today, forget about what's happening at the top, the real story is at the bottom. 45 million people. Look at what's happening at the business scene, small and medium-sized enterprises. Look at what's happening inside the universities right now. The labor movement again. Massive ideas. It's not reported in The Guardian or not reported in the Financial Times. It is basically happening in the street. And in my view, we might lose 5 years. We might lose 10 years. History doesn't happen in 18 days or 1 year or 2 years. But out of this experiment, I think a country with a massive rich heritage like Egypt will evolve effectively a new stage. Not new leaders, nobody cares about the leaders, but effectively new ideas. And in my view, one idea out of Egypt is very important to reflect upon. The liberal experiment of Egypt in the first half of the 20th century that had many, many, many positives. And one tiny point, I'll stop, is look at the Egyptian media. Over the past 15 years, every single successful TV series in Egypt was very nostalgic to the idea of the Egyptian society in the 1930s and 40s when it was cosmopolitan, secular, liberal, open. There's this nostalgia for a failed country that does not deserve to fail, for a generations that inherited failures they did not contribute to.
There's a microphone, if my poor eyesight can actually trace it, is over there somewhere.
Hi, good
evening.
evening.
Ask away.
I want to ask a question about democracy building in Egypt. You mentioned that there's a real lack of democratic institutions in the country. Can you explain who you can see picking up the shortfall of these institutions?
Hassan.
Well, it is actually a combined effect. I mean, institutions are being rebuilt again, actually, and as Tariq and Ahdaf have already spoken about, there is already organizations that have been happening. There is a parallel trade union movement that is happening in Egypt, as opposed to the governmental trade union that actually more or less get ordered by whatever government is there of what to be done. That free trade union is being fought somehow. The laws that were, I mean, one of the major demands of the revolution was the right to strike and whatever and so on. The first act SCAF has put and pushed is to prevent strikes and to prevent whatever under the banner that this will destroy the economy. So, but this movement is carrying on. There is a hell of a lot of that, and that's what builds the movement. There is youth movement every place. There is also organized Islamic forces, which are inside those. You see, we really have to look that the Islamic forces are part of the revolution and not only part of counter-revolution, okay? And within that monolith that has been so united in opposition, there is massive waves and shades and forms of people within it. Some has left, some within it strife, and there will be a recreation of that. One final point about this Islamic thing, if I may say. Egypt is not Iran. Egypt doesn't have oil. Egypt is not Saudi Arabia. Egypt have heritage and have human power. If you don't utilize it in the proper way, you will have a continued social and economic crisis that need to be solved. And therefore, without a national program in Egypt for development, encompass almost the majority of the political forces against nepotism, against lies, against also big money, etc., there will be no solution. And the continued fight, which will be social in one hand and essentially democratic on the other, democracy favors the poor. Democracy favors the disenfranchised. And so on, that will recreate that scenario. So one cannot pinpoint one, but these processes altogether.
Let me ask you, I mean, one of the issues that was mentioned to me, I mean, you've already mentioned the need for reform of law, but one of the other issues that was mentioned to me when I was in Cairo last week was, you know, one of the other areas that still remained unreformed was the state media. I mean, how do you see, you know, the state media being reformed as part of the process of democracy building? Does it require it or does it not?
It's required, but is it possible or not? This is the question, I think. I'm afraid that the state media, after I spent this years inside it, and as I said before, I get into this place with a dream of putting this idea. The only way at the last years, I say, which I tried to have a parallel public service within this state TV. But this is what I discovered in the middle of the crisis, the uprising, that at the end of the day, the state TV with this format, it will be state TV, and it will not be a public TV. This state TV has something like 43,000 employees inside it. All what this building needs to be run accurately is just 10% of this 43,000. And at the same time, the government, any government, does not have the privilege of getting rid of any of one of these. So I believe that it has a problem, and part of the plan for the future is to think how to create a public media, a taxpayer public media.
Can I stop you? There's a gentleman at the back who has the microphone.
Opinion polls suggest, and my Egyptian friends tell me they're reasonably credible polls, that 70% plus of Egyptians today think the army is a noble patriotic force. And my friends went on to tell me that even more depressing for them is that this suggests that a large number of Egyptians seem to buy the quite extraordinary narrative put forth by the military, repeated endlessly on state-run television, that all the demonstrators and activists are in the pay of foreign forces. They're apparently trained in Bosnia or Serbia or someplace. I haven't quite figured out why that's part of the conspiracy.
Even Dubai, I believe.
And that therefore anyone who comes and demonstrates is somehow driving a wedge between the great Egyptian people and the heroic
This is an
armed
interesting
forces.
issue. I mean, this came across.
If this is true, why? How can we understand this? Why would Egyptians buy such a lot of nonsense?
I mean, this has come across a lot last week. This narrative that's being tried to be sold, and the raids on the NGOs, the prosecutions of activists. I mean, what do you think is going on? Is this a deliberate narrative designed to create a crisis?
Yes, of course. Everything that they do is a deliberate narrative designed to create a crisis. That we don't have security. Well, you know, how come you're in charge of the country for 10 months and are unable to do something about a police force that isn't functioning, and then blame 200 people sitting in Tahrir for, you know, the lack of security? What's happening with the economy? That the economy is about to fail because of the revolution, because of the young people in Tahrir. Oh, really? How exactly does that work? Explain the mechanics. So basically, I find these red herrings, you know, they just take up your time and your energy, and I think that anybody who is seriously concerned about the country and wishes it well, what they're doing now is they're working out what they should be doing, and they're doing it, and they're acting rather than spending time, you know, and part of acting is actually talking to people. And yes, it's true that people are tired and that people would prefer to believe something comforting, but when you actually do sit and talk to them, within like 4 sentences, they've shown that they actually believe what you believe, but there's just a veneer. So we'll see what happens.
Well, in some way, I agree with Mr. Manawi about this. State media is run as a state of misinformation, consistently. And not only state media, but the majority of the private TVs owned and whatever are run at the same level. So it is not surprising. They are not 70%, however, because that was the rating of the army about 5 months ago. After Maspero and after all sorts of things that happened after Mohammed Mahmoud and so on, the army still hold more than 50% of the support of the people because of the continued misinformation that is happening. And it's used by every level. Subtle ways of saying it, getting experts nice in the pay, but say few things for and against and so on. Then you get the state media consistently drumming that story. You know, the ragtag in the square, people who are not thinking, they are not the people who went with the revolution, they are now the thugs and whatever and so on. And obviously a lot of middle class and other people who are the people being polled effectively actually are feeling frightened and worried and not sure about the future. And who would be? We are not. But there are, in this kind of scenario, two choices. Yes, the revolutionary force, I can tell you that what is called the revolutionary forces before the 25th of January would have got perhaps 2 or 3%. Currently, it got 20% or more of the people at least supporting it or thinking about it. And that will continue to rise. It's a state of flux. Also, don't forget that the Islamic forces in general are somehow staying neutral in this, because their only aspect is to win the election. Is actually anything doesn't matter till to get legitimacy through parliament. And therefore, they have not been involved in that daily things. In fact, they continuously put the point that the demonstrations after Maspero and so on were planned by the army so as to stop the election. So we and our kids who are in the pay of the United States of America, etc., have agreed with the army to create an upheaval and get killed so as to postpone the election, so as to prevent them from having legitimacy.
That gentleman in the white shirt.
Yes.
I think you've got the microphone, have you?
I have.
Oh, yes, you do indeed.
My question is directed to Mr. Menawi. Yes, my question is directed to Mr. Menawi. You reflected more on your past and your role and your dream of revolutionizing the Egyptian TV, but you didn't really reflect or elaborate on how you see the evolvement of the Egyptian TV now, because I think it's been going through a substantial change in how they treat the Egyptian mind, not as complete morons, for example, as before the 11th of February, telling us that we are thugs, that we eat Kentucky and accept 50 euros to be and public sexual intercourse in the tents in Tahrir. I mean, this was an evolvement in the way they treated us as Egyptians. So what do you think? Because my mom was the head of censorship in Egyptian TV, so I know exactly how the army dealt with the TV. It did not really control it. It secured it from other forces to actually occupy the building. So you had control until the 11th of February, and then SCAF took over. So it's not really accurate what you said.
I mean, can I ask you my own quick question in addition to this? I mean, I was talking to an activist last week who said that state television is still putting out lies about certain activists, putting their phone numbers on the TV. I mean, do you think it's moved at all? I mean, as he's saying, where do you see it's gone, and where is it going?
Again, the main problem with the state TV is the structure itself. The main point is to turn this TV to be a real TV and a real media, is for the people who are working inside this building to be a real journalists, to believe that they are journalists, they are not just employees. And what's going on for a long time, very long time ago, since 1960, that they are dealing with TV as they are working for any building, any government building, and this is what they have to change. What's going on now? Now again, the state TV, as I said, I discovered that the state TV will not turn to be a real public TV with this illness inside this structure. You cannot run a body with 43,000 while all what you need is 3,000 or 4,000 of them, and you have to feed them, pay them. You will not be able even to create any kind of real professional work. Again, to tell the truth, it's part of being professional, and you will not be able to have this professionalism while you have this kind of real problem in the structure.
Can I bring in Tarek here, because I know you want to say something on this.
I noticed there's a number of points about the state TV and the radio and what they say and all. In my view, again, this is just a symptom, not the real issue. State TV is effectively the TV of the state. So if the state is not particularly functioning, if the state is failing,
exactly,
then basically, well,
the state is a liar, for example.
Well, anyway, if the state is a failure, then you'd expect anyway its TV to be a failure. You'd expect its leading newspaper to be a failure. You'd expect its universities to be a failure. If the system at its heart is not necessarily functioning, then its arms would not necessarily be functioning. But the point I want to throw after that, if you'd like, is, are we going to expect the state that's running right now, that's more or less in a transitory period between the old state that has ruled Egypt for the past 60 years to reform itself? How come? This state is effectively in a defense mode because it has seen attack, and that attack is coming from the street, bottom up. You would not expect logically that the state will reform itself, so it would be extremely irrational for the state TV or for the public whatever to reform itself. It is opposing the change. That's ABC politics, sociopolitics basically. What will happen, certainly in my view, is that the same revolutionary forces, which by the way are not necessarily liberal, many of them were Islamist, the same revolutionary forces, the young, will change. So the modus operandi, the power structures, whether in state TV or otherwise, will be discarded. It will fight slightly, but it will be discarded at the end, and new forms will emerge. So I think the idea of very stable, slow, gradual, self-induced change, in my view, is a fantasy. You are seeing effectively socio-political change from the bottom. It's you who's going to change, and I know you personally were actually on Tahrir.
A gentleman in the blue and white striped shirt.
Hi, it's a general question to the panel. Even though he's just one person, but with Baradei removing himself from the presidential race, will this work for or against the revolutionary movement? Or will he become like a Gandhi figure, or long-term and short-term effect?
I think it'll work for the revolution, because I think that he has now actually liberated himself from the constraints and the strictures of running for office, from the possibility of that sort of blackening of his name that was happening all the time. And as a candidate, he was one among several. Now he's stepped away from that, so he's in a clearer space. And notice, of course, I'm sure you all have, that a few days before he declared that he would not run for president, he put forward an economic plan, a very detailed economic plan, which was really brilliant, and which was very much in line with the aims of the revolution, but was, also sensible, and people could correct me if I'm wrong. And so I think, and he has said clearly that he will free himself from working in politics in order to work for the revolution. I think it's a good step, and I welcome it. In the situation we're in, I welcome it.
Well, I had a mixed feeling about it, but I totally concur in general with what I have to say. My mixed feeling was literally that Baradei was perhaps the only figure among all the presidential candidates that could at least unite all what is called the revolutionary forces, the left, the liberal, whatever, and so on and so forth. And one of the problems, in fact, of the revolutionary forces is the lack of unity. And that is by itself. So you fire, but you don't fire all in the same direction. But that being said, he has been subjected to the most vicious campaign anybody in Egyptian politics ever has been subjected to in history. Throughout the time he came, he was so resilient. In fact, he's so stubborn to the point that he might be stupid on some occasions. I have supported him from day one. I've always believed, and I still believe, that he is the best thing that can ever happen to Egypt if he were to become a president, because he's a true democrat and a social democrat who want to effect change, who believed in people. And by going out, he actually genuinely believed in people. The whole notion that he will not go even and visit villages and whatever with 10 or 20. He wanted people to act. He wanted people to collect signatures and to collect this and to engender that movement. And he, by this, is not the reason, but part of the real forces that have led to the 25th of January. There is no figure hated by SCAF or a lot of other forces, especially of the old regime, more than Baradei. And therefore, his withdrawal is effectively to say the revolution will continue, is not going to finish on this. Plus, he's pretty stubborn. There must be a constitution, then a president. As far as he's concerned, to know my job description halfway through or after I'm elected is not on. And this consistency pays off in the long term. Obviously, his assets, at least within the revolutionary forces, have risen immensely. And if he were to continue, and I believe he will, to actually act as a unifying force, create a foundation, put the program and all sorts of things, then that may well help immensely.
There's a gentleman at the back who seems to be quite appropriately sitting underneath a picture of a civilian protester at Kent State, I think. So what's your question, sir?
Thank you. My name is Abdul Qavi, and one point which we don't seem to have taken into account is the total dependence of SCAF, or the military high command, on American largesse, which has allowed it to set up a parallel state in Egypt. Now I see a parallel, exact parallel of this paradigm in the Pakistan army and its role in the politics of Pakistan. So Mr. Abdullah and Adaf and Tariq, would you like to reflect the point?
It's a good question. I mean, one of the issues is they're trying to avoid transparency.
Let me finish it.
We don't have much time, sir.
The point that Israel is never going to allow, or rather will use its influence in America to ensure that Egyptian army never gets to act according to the wishes of its people.
Tariq.
I'll just throw forward 3 points because obviously for brevity, but I think I heard a lot the comparison to two countries when it comes to the military, to Turkey and to Pakistan. Since you mentioned Pakistan, I'll just draw a very important point, which I think is crucially important in this issue. In Pakistan, the army is to a very large extent Punjabi. So basically, that means that at least half of the country is structurally out of the army. And that means that to a very large extent, the army is entrenching a certain, not sectarian, but tribal, I would say even racial definition of the army, of the state. In Egypt, that's not the case. Actually, a point that Mr. Al-Manawi said very correctly is that the Egyptian middle class is, I would say, intrinsically linked to the Egyptian military. Every single family in Egypt in middle class probably have a representative in the military or some sort of a link. So the entrenchment of the military establishment in Egypt in the middle class is dramatically higher than it is in Pakistan. And the second point I would just again throw for reflection is that whereas the military establishment in Pakistan has repeatedly done coup d'etat to retake the state from the civilian authority, in Egypt it has won one single coup d'etat in 1952 that until today is the pillar base structure of the state. But if you note that the Egyptian middle class have dramatically increased over the past 30 years, and then note the link between this middle class and the military establishment, it is not a major leap of faith to expect that the military, if it is sophisticated, it would realize that it is not to stop this dramatic momentum coming from the street. A final point about the geostrategic issue you mentioned, I think it's almost a no-brainer right now, is that for the past 30 years, Egypt was effectively in the regional arena asleep, was away. The Egyptian narrative was completely out of the picture. And it's certainly a fact that it is coming. A rising Egypt, a new state, is coming to the Middle East. But it's not coming because the military will take an assertive role and America will try to stop it. I think this is a minor story. It is coming because you have now representation in Egypt. We had 28 million Egyptians that did vote in 3 weeks. That's dramatic. That power coming, and that power wants some sort of a resurgent Egypt. Again, it will not take 2 months or 6 months, but the power is coming to the Middle East. And that's geostrategically a big story.
Very briefly.
Just very quickly about the American part in this. America will not allow. I mean, if we work internationally on America will never allow, then we should never ever revolt anywhere in the world or effect anything whatsoever. America will be forced by the people if we work on that level. America, at the end of the day, wants its own interest in the area to be preserved. Some of that is a subject of conflict. Some of that can be negotiated, etc. At the end of the day, it is about the local forces. I totally agree. America is supporting the army in Egypt, in Pakistan, creating a parallel state. But it is our role to chisel that and to try to weaken this, to recreate a new alliance and a battle.
I'm going to ask a last question because we're running out of time. And I'm going to ask everyone the same question, starting with you. So, optimist or pessimist? And frame it on the spectrum if you like.
I'm afraid for the short period, I'm not optimistic at all. I'm afraid for the short period, I'm afraid that we are facing hard time. We are facing a period of turbulence. I don't think that we will have a stable country for the coming few. But for the long period, and as Tariq said before, 10 years of nation, it's not a big deal. I mean, if we will be able to reach to the country we dream with, yes. But for the short period, I'm not optimistic at all.
Well, I mean, if you are with the revolution, you have to be optimistic, as a rule. And I personally, genuinely believe that there has already been substantial changes in Egypt, and they are for the good. There are people who are trying to prevent that and to stop the wheel of history. And that is led by SCAF, by a lot of people in the middle class in Egypt, in the older generation, and all sorts of things. And they may succeed in one area here or there. But the forces that my colleague spoke about here, the young, the socioeconomic scenario, and so on, is inevitable to continue this process. And the only emancipation of the people, especially in the Middle East, is through democratic changes and creating social justice. So we can have a state of upheaval for 5-6 years. It took 8 years for the French Revolution. It may well take that. But ultimately speaking, effect, the way I see it, is going to come.
I'm totally optimistic, and I say that while bearing in mind and in my heart all the time the sacrifices that have been made and that are probably yet to be made. Every time we speak about the revolution, we always carry with us shuhada, the people who've been killed, and the people who have been injured, and the people who have lost years of their lives. But they actually are an extra reason to be optimistic, because they are a very powerful reason why nobody is going to back down, why the revolution will continue, and why it will actually achieve the goals for which these people made their sacrifices. I'm completely optimistic.
I'm usually blamed for being a pessimist because the name of my book was Egypt on the Brink. People say, oh my God. That came out before the revolution, by the way. I'm an optimist for one simple reason. As I try to explain my view, at least, this is not just an uprising or revolution or trying to get rid of Mubarak or a power structure. In my view, this is a new phase in Egyptian history, and by the weight and strategic weight of this country, a new phase in Arab history. So look at the demographics, look at the civil society, and that, in my view, is certainly optimistic.
Well, thank you very much indeed. This has been a wonderful debate. I'd like to thank Abdul Latif, whose name is now completely burned in my brain. And I just have to say that having completely blanked an old friend tonight in the bar, I mean, he's not the only person whose name I've forgotten. I blame it on my age. Thank you very much, Hassan. Thank you. And thank you, Tariq. And I'm sure that we'll all be here again, because we've been here several times in the last year to debate these crucial and fascinating issues. Thank you.
Thank you.